3 days before our son's due date, my wife walked me into the nursery and told me to stay calm. The paint was still drying, cloud gray. I'd rolled that wall myself the week we found out he was a boy. She held her belly with both hands. "I have to tell you something before the baby comes." I set the crib wrench on the floor. I nodded. I told her thank you for finally being honest. She cried. From relief, I think. She believed the hard part was behind us. It wasn't. 6 months back, I'd started counting backward from that due date. The week it kept landing on was a week I hadn't been home. So I asked one quiet question. Just one. The kind only a man who already knew would think to ask. Her face went white before I reached the end of it. I'm Soren, 32, and I've spent my whole life being the man people trust and never quite respect. That night in the nursery, the woman I loved found out those aren't the same thing. Let me take you back to how I got there. You'd have called us lucky. We had a small blue house on a street named after a tree that no longer grew there. I'm a structural engineer, bridges, wind towers, the kind of work where you learn that everything standing is standing because someone checked the math when it was boring to check. Vivian taught 4th grade. We married in a backyard in June, 4 years back. Under lights, her mother strung between 2 maples. Everyone said the same thing about me at the wedding. Steady, safe, reliable, a good man. I used to take those words as a compliment. Vivian was warm in a way that pulled people toward her. She remembered your dog's name. She cried at other people's good news. When she looked at you, you felt chosen. I'd spent 30 years being the reliable one at the edge of every room, and she walked in and put me at the center of hers. Or she seemed to. I learned to be that reliable one early, and I didn't learn it gently. My father was a big, charming, unreliable man who called me steady, the way you'd describe a mule, with a kind of affection that was really just relief that someone in the house would carry the weight without asking to be thanked. By 10, I was the one who checked that the doors were locked and the stove was off, because no one else would, and everyone praised me for it, and no one ever asked whether a 10-year-old should be the one lying awake listening for the click of a latch. That's the wound, if you want to name it. I was loved for being useful, and I never once got to test whether I'd be loved without it. So I made myself so useful no one would have a reason to leave. It works, mostly. Until you marry someone who figures out that a man that afraid of being left will forgive almost anything to stay. We wanted a baby for 2 years before we got one. There was a loss in between. A pregnancy that stopped at 11 weeks, the spring before last. I don't talk about that part much. She stopped sleeping. I'd find her at 2 in the morning in the empty room that would someday be a nursery, sitting on a folding chair in the dark. We came apart a little that year, quietly, the way careful people do. I told myself we were grieving as a team. I told myself a lot of things. Then, last fall, she told me she was pregnant again, and the whole house changed color. That's the part I keep coming back to. How happy I was. How completely. I painted that room 3 times before she liked the shade. I built the crib on a Sunday and read the instructions twice, because that's who I am. At the 20-week scan, I watched a gray shape on a screen turn into a spine, a hand, a heartbeat drumming fast as a bird, and the technician said, "There's your boy." And I had to sit down. Vivian laughed at me for it, sweetly. She reached over and wiped my face with her thumb and said, "You're going to be such a good dad." I believed her. I put my hand on her stomach that night and felt him move for the first time, and I cried again in the dark, quietly, so I wouldn't wake her. After the year we'd had, it felt like the universe apologizing. Here's what I didn't know yet. I didn't know that while I was counting weeks forward with a pencil, somebody else in that family had already counted them backward and was praying I never would. Before I go any further, if this is already sitting heavy in your chest, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because stories like this one only reach the people who need them when you do. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read everyone. It helps me know this found you. Now let me tell you about the afternoon the first thread came loose. It was March. The room was half finished then. One gray wall, the crib still in its box, a drop cloth over the floor. The obstetrician's folder sat on the dresser, the glossy kind they hand you with the ultrasound tucked inside. I picked it up because I'm the person who reads the folder. Estimated due date, it said, and a date in late July. I don't know why I did the math. I do math the way other people hum. I counted backward, 40 weeks, the way the books do it. And I landed on a week in the middle of October. And I stood there in that quiet room with a wet paintbrush going stiff in my hand. Because in the middle of October, I had been on a barge off the coast of Maine for 19 days, inspecting anchor welds on a wind platform with no cell signal after 4 in the afternoon. I want to be honest about what I felt. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even certainty. It was the small, cold click of a number that doesn't reconcile. In my work, when a number doesn't reconcile, you don't panic. You don't accuse the steel. You go back and you check your assumptions, one at a time, until either the number was wrong or the bridge was. So I told myself the number was wrong. Due dates move. Babies come early, come late. Conception isn't a calendar you can trust to the day. I put the folder down. I finished the wall. I didn't say a word. But that night, after Vivian fell asleep, I did something quiet and precise. I opened my work email and I found the project rotation for last fall. Crew manifests, vessel logs, the dry, boring paperwork of a job where liability means everything gets recorded. And there it was, in a spreadsheet no one had touched since November. My name, the barge, the dates. October the 8th to the 26th. Offshore. Confirmed by a company that gets sued if the dates are wrong. I hadn't been home for a single day of the week. The math kept circling. I closed the laptop. I looked at the ceiling for a long time, and I told myself still that there were a dozen innocent explanations, and that a decent man doesn't build a case against his pregnant wife off a spreadsheet. I just didn't delete the spreadsheet. The second thread came loose at the baby shower. Vivian's mother, Marguerite, hosted it. Marguerite is the kind of woman who runs a room the way I run a load calculation. Nothing left to chance. Every seat assigned. Every outcome pre-decided. She's 61, silver, elegant, and she has spent her entire adult life making sure the family looked a certain way from the outside. Her own husband left her when Vivian was 9. She never let anyone forget it, and she never let it happen to the family image again. She'd never quite warmed to me. I always assumed it was because I wasn't impressive. No family money, no name she could drop at her club, no story. Just a man who checked welds and read instructions twice. At the shower, she was everywhere at once, steering conversations, refilling glasses, correcting the caterer with a smile that could cut glass. At one point, I said something about wanting to do the night feeding so Vivian could sleep, and Marguerite laughed lightly and told the room, "Oh, Soren means well, but men always think they'll help, and then the mother does it all anyway." Small laughter. Vivian didn't defend me. I let it go. You let 100 of those go. Later, I went to the kitchen for more ice, and I heard my mother-in-law's voice through the door, low, talking to her sister. "He's a good boy," Marguerite was saying. "He's steady. He'll be a wonderful father." A pause. "He's too decent to ever check." Ice in my hands, cold going straight up my arms. Too decent to ever check. I stood there, and I didn't move, and I thought, check what? I carried the ice back in. I smiled for every photo. I held the tiny gray hat someone had knit, and I said it was perfect. And I meant it. And I set it on the gift table, and I couldn't stop looking at it. And a part of me, that I still don't fully understand, filed that sentence away in the exact place I file the readings that don't reconcile. That was the night the barge in Maine stopped being a coincidence and started being a question. Now, I know what you're thinking, because I thought it too. You're thinking, ask her. Just ask her. And you're right that a normal man would have. But I want you to understand something about being the reliable one. When you've spent your whole life as the person who doesn't make scenes, who absorbs, who keeps the peace so everyone else can fall apart, you learn that the moment you raise your voice, you become the problem. The story stops being what happened and becomes how you reacted. I'd watched it happen to other men. The wife does something and cries. And somehow the husband is the villain for not being calm enough about it. So I didn't ask. Not yet. I went to Wesley instead. Wesley Callahan and I met in a dorm hallway at 19. Both of us kicking the same broken vending machine over the same lost dollar. He's a family law attorney now, in the city, good at it in the quiet way that scares the loud ones. I called him on a Tuesday and told him I needed a coffee and a hypothetical. We met at a diner off the interstate where no one we knew would be. Vinyl booths, burnt coffee, a waitress who called us both hon. I laid it out flat the way I'd lay out a failure analysis. The due date, the barge, the spreadsheet, the sentence through the kitchen door. I kept my voice level the whole time, and Wesley listened the whole time, turning his cup a slow quarter turn on the table. And when I finished, he didn't tell me I was being paranoid. He said, "What do you want, Soren?" I said I didn't know yet. He set the cup down. "Then here's the map," he said. "You've actually got two different cases, and if you mix them up, you'll lose both. Case 1 is the marriage, whether she was faithful. That case you can win if you're patient and you don't do anything stupid, because the truth about a weekend leaves a trail whether you like it or not. Case 2 is the baby, whose he is." He shook his head slowly. "That case you cannot win right now. You cannot legally establish the paternity of an unborn child without her cooperation, not without a needle in her belly and her consent, and you are not going to do that. So you will not know about the baby until the baby is born. Don't let anyone push you into fighting the case you can't win yet." 2 cases. I wrote that on the inside of my skull. Then he leaned in and gave me the sentence I've thought about more than any other in this whole thing. "And whatever that baby story turns out to be, decide right now, tonight, that you will not take it out on the kid. Kids don't get a vote in what the adults did. If you can't promise me that, don't go looking, because looking will change you, and you have to know which man comes out the other side." I told him I already knew that part. I told him the kid would be the one thing I'd never let this touch. He said, "Then go carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't move money. And don't let anyone convince you that finding out is the crime." I paid for the coffee. I always pay for the coffee. Pause the story for a second, because I'm curious. A due date that lands on a week you were gone. A company spreadsheet that proves it. A mother-in-law who calls you too decent to check. If that were your marriage, what's the very first thing you'd do? Ask her outright, or go looking quietly first. Tell me in the comments. Most people say one thing and do the other. I'll show you which one I turned out to be. I went looking. Not the way you're picturing. I didn't hire anyone to follow her. I didn't crack her phone. I never once put a camera in my own house or kept some secret little notebook of her sins. I want to be clear about that, because the man I was trying to stay was the whole point. I just stopped training myself not to see the things that were already in plain view, like the lake house. Marguerite's family has a place 3 hours north on a cold, clean lake, in a town with 1 gas station and a diner that closes at 8. Every October, Vivian and her sisters do a weekend up there. Girls only. Wine and a fire and no husbands. She'd gone last October, the same October, the week the math kept circling, and come home quiet and sunburned and strange, and I'd chalked it up to the anniversary of the loss. Grief looks like a lot of things. I'd been so careful to give her room for it. I'd been proud of myself for giving her room. In April, I found the scarf. It was in the trunk of her car, under the jack. When I went to change a bald tire she'd been ignoring for a month. A man's scarf, wool, gray-green, expensive, that I had never seen and that did not smell like our house. It smelled like cologne and wood smoke. I sat back on my heels in the driveway and I held it for a while. And then I put the jack back exactly the way it had been. And I set the scarf back under it, folded the way I'd found it. And I closed the trunk. And I stood in that driveway for a long time. A man's scarf under the jack of a car that had gone to a girl's weekend. I want to tell you, I marched inside and confronted her that night. I didn't. Here's the truth about that, and it isn't flattering. I was afraid, not of the scarf, of what asking would make me. I was afraid that the second I opened my mouth, I'd become a man shouting at his 8 months pregnant wife in a garage, and I would never get to be anything else again in anyone's memory, including my own. Marguerite would have her story handed to her, gift-wrapped. See, he's not well. He turned on her. So I did the coward's brave thing. I got precise instead. Small lake towns like that have a caretaker, someone who plows the road and checks the pipes and keeps a log of who used the house, when, for the insurance. It's an ordinary business record. Owners ask for it all the time. I found the number on the little community website, and I called it on a Thursday for my truck, calm as a man ordering lumber, and said I was helping the family sort out some paperwork and needed to confirm the dates the house was used last October. The caretaker was a talker, older fella, glad for the company. He read the dates off the log without a second thought. Friday to Monday. the second week of October. And then, because people volunteer things when you don't sound like you want anything, he added, that was the weekend the Ashford girl came up with the gentleman. Nice fella. Green Subaru. Left a scarf on the porch rail, matter of fact. I meant to mail it back and never did. A pause. Just the two of them. That trip. Real quiet weekend. Just the two of them. There were no sisters that weekend. I thanked him. I told him not to worry about the scarf. It had turned up. I hung up. I sat in the parking lot of a hardware store and put both hands on the wheel and breathed until the ringing in my ears stopped and the world came back level. Green Subaru. Gray-green scarf. Friday to Monday. A week I was on a barge with no signal. The number reconciled. Now I had to find out who the gentleman was, and I had to do it without becoming someone I couldn't take back. His name was Damon. I didn't have to dig hard, which is its own kind of gut punch. He wasn't a secret to everyone, just to me. Vivian and Damon dated all through college. 6 years, the kind of first love that families half plan a wedding around before it falls apart. He'd moved out to the coast, then come back last year for a job. I found him the way anyone finds anyone now. A mutual friend's photos, a tagged face, a comment thread. The same face leaning against a green Subaru at a reunion last summer, standing a little too close to my wife, his hand not quite on her back, but thinking about it. I looked at that photo for a long time, not with hate, with a strange clinical grief, like reading the report on a collapse you were hired to prevent and didn't. Here's the part I keep turning over. I could have stopped there. I had the affair, the scarf, the log, the man, the timeline. That alone ends a marriage. But the affair wasn't the thing that hollowed me out. It was the arithmetic. If the weekend was the second week of October and the due date was late July, then the child my wife was carrying, the boy whose wall I'd painted cloud gray, whose crib I'd built on a Sunday reading the instructions twice, whose spine I'd watched turn into a heartbeat on a screen, that boy might not be mine. And she knew it. She had to know it. You don't count these things by accident when you're the one they're happening to. I called Wesley again and said 4 words. It might be worse. He said, come in Monday. I drove home. Vivian was on the couch with her feet up, glowing, my wife, and she looked up and said, how was your day? And I said it was long, and I made her tea, because that's who I am. And I stood in the kitchen with my back to her while the kettle ticked, and I understood that I was going to have to become someone new to survive this, and that I would rather die than let it turn me cruel. The strangest part of that spring was how ordinary it looked from the outside. I kept going to work. I kept building the nursery. I assembled a changing table and mounted a shelf and installed the little outlet covers, even though the baby wouldn't crawl for a year, because doing the boring, safe thing was the only thing that kept my hands from shaking. Vivian and I still watched our shows. We still laughed. One night, she fell asleep against my shoulder on the couch, and I sat there not moving my arm for 2 hours so I wouldn't wake her, loving her exactly as much as I ever had, and knowing exactly what she'd done. If you've never held those two things at once, I hope you never have to. It is a very specific kind of loneliness. You're the only person in the marriage who knows what the marriage actually is. There were moments that nearly undid me because they were tender. She'd take my hand and put it on her belly when he kicked and whisper, that's your boy saying hi. And I'd smile and feel him move and love him with my whole chest. And the word your would land in me like a stone dropped down a well. And I'd count the seconds before I heard the splash. The worst one was the Saturday we set up the crib together. She wanted to help, even huge and tired. So we did it as a team, the way we'd done everything. Me reading the instructions, her handing me the pieces, both of us laughing when a bolt rolled under the dresser and neither of us could reach it. At the end, we stood back and looked at it, this small white cage full of nothing but future, and she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, I can't believe he's almost here. And I put my arm around her and said, neither can I. And I meant something she'd never understand, and she took it as love. And it was love. That was the unbearable thing. It was still love, even then. I lay awake that night thinking that grief and love aren't opposites. They're the same water at different temperatures. I'd been living in both at once for months, and the crib in the next room didn't care which one I was drowning in. It just sat there in the dark, assembled correctly, every bolt torqued to spec, waiting for a boy who might never be mine to come home to a nursery built by a man who'd checked everything except the one thing he wasn't allowed to check yet. We went to a childbirth class that spring too. 6 couples on yoga mats in a church basement, a nurse showing us how to breathe, how to time the waves, when to go to the hospital. I was the husband who took notes. Of course I was. I wrote down the hospital bag checklist and the contraction intervals and the warning signs, and the nurse used me as the good example twice, and the other men shot me the look men give the guy who's making them look bad. Vivian squeezed my hand and beamed, and I sat there on that mat dutifully learning how to catch a baby that a lab would later tell me wasn't mine. And I thought, this is either the most foolish thing a man has ever done or the most stubborn act of love, and I genuinely could not tell which, and I still can't. I learned the breathing anyway. When the night came, months of all of it collapsing at once, I was the one who stayed calm and counted the intervals and got her to the car. Because that's the thing nobody in that family ever understood about me. My steadiness was never ignorance. It was a decision I kept making, over and over, even after I knew exactly what it was costing me. Twice I almost told her, once at the kitchen sink, the words all the way up in my throat, I know about the lake. And I looked at her, 30-something weeks along, humming, rinsing a cup, and I thought of what Wesley said about the kid and about the case I couldn't win yet, and I swallowed it back down. The second time was in the car at a red light. I actually opened my mouth. Then the light turned green and I drove, because that is the whole story of my life in one sentence. The light turned green and I drove and I said nothing, and I got where I was going. Vivian was fighting her own quiet war that spring, and I could see it if I looked, though I don't think she knew I could. There was an afternoon she told me she was going to a checkup and asked me, insisted gently, that I not come, because it was just routine, boring, no point in you taking off work. She'd never once told me not to come before. I went to all of them. I said okay, and I found out later the plain way from an appointment reminder left face up on the counter that it hadn't been her regular OB at all. It was a different office across town, a maternal fetal specialist, the kind of place you go when you want a question answered early and privately. I never learned exactly what she asked them, and I never will, but a woman doesn't drive across town, alone, and lie about it, to hear that everything is boring and routine. She was counting too. She'd been counting since October, same as me, from the other side of the same secret. We were 2 people in one house, both awake at night doing the same math, each certain the other one was asleep. The difference was what we decided to do with the number. She decided to bury it and use my goodness as the shovel. I decided the number belonged to a child, and that a child is owed the truth even when the adults can't afford it. That's not a small difference. In the end, it was the only difference that mattered. But I didn't get where I was going the way they thought. I was getting precise. I went to an appointment with her in May. I always went. And while she was in with the doctor, I sat in the waiting room with the other fathers. And when the OB came out to walk us to the front, I asked her, easy and curious, the kind of thing an eager dad asks, how they date these things, how sure the window was. She smiled and told me what they always tell you. They estimate from the last cycle. They confirm with the early ultrasound, and the early ultrasound is accurate to within a few days. A few days, not a few weeks. I thanked her. Vivian squeezed my arm and said, "He loves this stuff. He's such a nerd." And everyone laughed, and I laughed, and inside me the window narrowed from a maybe to a wall. The early ultrasound put conception in the second week of October, give or take a handful of days. The same handful of days I'd been standing on a barge, watching a crane swing steel over gray water, 400 miles from my wife. Work was the one place that spring where I still knew exactly who I was. There's a young engineer on my crew, Petra, sharp and fast and a little too sure. That June, she signed off on a set of tension readings for a pedestrian bridge, and the numbers looked fine, and everyone wanted to move on because it was Friday. I asked her to run them again. She sighed. The polite sigh young people give slow old men. She ran them again to prove me wrong, and on the second pass, one anchor bolt came back 4% under spec. 4%. Nothing you'd feel walking across it. Everything you'd feel the day it let go under a school group. We caught it because I made us look twice at a number that seemed fine. Petra didn't apologize exactly, but she got quiet. And at the end of the day, she said, "How'd you know to check that one?" I told her the only piece of wisdom I own. I didn't. I never know which one's lying. That's why you check the ones that look fine. The ones that look wrong announce themselves. It's the comfortable numbers that fail you. I drove home from that site and sat in my own driveway a minute before I went in, because I'd just described my marriage to a 26-year-old without either of us knowing it. The comfortable numbers are the ones that fail you. My wife had looked fine. My life had looked fine. Everyone had told me for years that I worried too much, checked too much, read the instructions twice like a nervous woman. And the one time it counted, the boring habit that made me a joke at my mother-in-law's table was the only reason I wasn't going to walk out onto a bridge that had already failed inspection. I went inside. I made Vivian tea. I checked the ones that looked fine. Through all of it, there was Damon. And I need to tell you about Damon because he wasn't just a name in a photo. He was a live wire, and I didn't control him. In May, I was picking Vivian up from the school where she teaches because her ankles had gotten too swollen to drive comfortably. I pulled into the lot early and I saw a green Subaru parked across the street, not moving, a man in the driver's seat, watching the front doors. I knew the car before I let myself know the car. He wasn't there for me. He was there for her. And the way he sat, patient, proprietary, told me something that turned my stomach colder than the scarf had. Damon wasn't a one-weekend mistake she'd walked away from. Damon thought he had a claim, maybe on her, maybe on more than her. I didn't get out of my truck. I want you to understand what that cost. Everything in a man wants to get out of the truck. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and I watched my wife come out the front doors, see the green car, and stop dead on the steps. I watched her shake her head at him, one small, sharp, terrified shake. I watched him pull away slow. And I watched her stand there with her hand on her belly, looking sick, before she spotted my truck and rearranged her whole face into a smile and waved. She got in. She said, "God, I'm so ready to have this baby." She said the classroom heater was broken again. She chattered the whole way home about nothing. And I said, and I drove. And neither of us said one true word. Now I knew the affair wasn't over in her heart the way she'd need everyone to believe it was. And I knew Damon was out there, unpredictable, a man who might blow the whole thing up himself on any afternoon, at her school, at our door, at a hospital. I wasn't the only one holding a match to this house. I was just the only one holding it steady. Damon didn't stay a shape in a car for long. He came to the house on a Saturday in June, while Vivian was at a prenatal yoga class her mother had signed her up for. I was in the garage sanding a rocking chair, an old one, my grandfather's, that I was fixing up for the nursery because a man has to keep his hands busy or his hands start thinking for him. I heard the green Subaru before I saw it. It pulled into my driveway like it had a right to. He got out slow, taller than his photos. He had the look of a man who'd rehearsed a speech and lost it somewhere between the car and the garage. "You're Soren," he said. "I am." "She here?" "She's out." He nodded, jammed his hands in his pockets, looked at the rocking chair, looked at me. And I watched him try to decide which version of this conversation we were going to have. I already knew mine. I set the sandpaper down and I waited because the person who talks first in a moment like that is the person who's afraid. And I had run out of fear somewhere back in April. "I don't know what she's told you," he started. "Nothing true," I said, "but I know most of it anyway. The lake, October, the 3 days. You can skip that part." That knocked the wind out of whatever he'd planned. He blinked. Then something harder came into his face and he said the thing he'd actually come to say. "That baby might be mine." I want to tell you, my face did something. It didn't. I'd had months to hold that exact sentence in my own mouth. Hearing it in his changed nothing about the arithmetic. "I know that too," I said. "Then you know I have a right to—" "To what?" I said it quietly and he stopped. "Say the end of that sentence. I'm curious which right you think you earned in a lake house you drove to in secret." He didn't say it. He looked at his shoes, and then, because guilt makes people honest in the ugliest way, he said, "I've been trying to talk to her for months. She won't answer. Her mother told me to disappear. Said there'd be money in it if I signed something swearing I was never there." He laughed, bitter. "So there it is. Your family gets real generous when they need a man to vanish." Her mother told me to disappear, money to sign something. Marguerite had been managing him too. Of course she had. She'd been managing everyone. Vivian, me, Elliot, and now the other man buying silence and papering over a weekend like it was a code violation she could permit her way around. I filed that away with everything else, in the place where the numbers go. I'm not going to fight you about the baby, I told him. If he's yours, and no test is going to care what any of us wanted. But I'm also not going to help you ambush a 9 months pregnant woman in a driveway. So here's what happens. You go home. When the baby's born, there'll be a real test in the open with everyone's consent. And whatever it says, the truth gets told. To you, to me, to the kid someday. No money, no signing, no vanishing. The truth, done right. He stared at me like I was speaking a language he didn't have. You'd do that, he said slowly. You'd make sure I knew, even if he isn't. Especially if, I said, a kid deserves to know his father. I'd have wanted to know. He got back in the green car. Before he pulled out, he rolled the window down and said, almost to himself, she told me you'd never figure any of it out. She was so sure. He shook his head. She married the wrong kind of quiet. Then he was gone, and I stood in the garage with my grandfather's chair and a new piece of the picture. That Marguerite had tried to buy off the one witness who could burn her, and that even the other man had underestimated me right up until he stood in my driveway. She married the wrong kind of quiet. I turned that over for a long time. Some quiet is empty. Some quiet is a man loading every fact into place, waiting for the one moment they'll all matter at once. It wasn't a single weekend either. I made myself learn that part too, because half knowing is its own kind of lie. It had started the summer before. The reunion in the photo, the one where Damon leaned on the green car a little too close. A drink that turned into a phone number that turned into months of the small electric nothing that comes before the something. By October, it was a weekend at a lake. That was the timeline, and I built it the way I build everything, one confirmed point at a time, refusing to round up or round down. Not because I enjoyed it, because a man about to change his whole life had better be standing on numbers he can defend, not a story he wants to be true. And here was the thing that kept me up worse than the affair. I wasn't the only one who could blow this open. Damon was out there hurt and shut out and told to vanish. And men like that don't vanish quietly. Any afternoon, he might show up at the school or the hospital or Marguerite's own front door and detonate the whole thing on his terms. A screaming scene, a wife dragged into a parking lot fight, a story that would spin out of anyone's control and land, somehow, as my fault for letting it get that bad. For about 2 weeks in June, I was sure he'd beat me to it. I'd lie awake doing the grim arithmetic. If Damon broke first, the reveal would be chaos. And chaos always gets blamed on the man standing closest with the least to lose. My careful, quiet plan would be worth nothing against one loud Tuesday. That was a small, private defeat, and I sat in it a while. Then I did the only thing you can do about a variable you don't control. I stopped trying to control it. I couldn't stop Damon from lighting a match, but I could make sure that when the truth came out, his way or mine, the family had already heard me say, in a steady voice, that I knew and had known for months, and was fine, so that no version of the story, however it broke, could ever start with Soren snapped. I couldn't pick the day, but I could make sure I wasn't the one who looked surprised on it. Meanwhile, Marguerite was at our house constantly, and I finally had the eyes to see what she was doing. She'd show up with curtains for the nursery, a bassinet that had been in the family, advice delivered like weather, but underneath the fussing was something I could suddenly read plainly. She was managing. She was managing Vivian, and she was managing me, and she was managing a situation she'd decided the outcome of months ago. She got sharper about me, too. Little erosions. She'd tell Vivian in front of me that the baby would need real family around, not just Soren muddling through. She rearranged the nursery I'd built, moved the crib away from the wall I'd chosen, told me the outlet covers were sweet, but you worry like a nervous woman. She had a gift for saying something cruel inside something helpful so that if you flinched, you were the difficult one. The worst of it came at a Sunday dinner in June. Marguerite hosted those too. She hosted everything. Hosting is how she held the leash. The whole family, the good but not the best china, a roast. I sat where I was put, And over one meal, she took me apart so gently that no one else in the room could ever have sworn a cruel word was spoken. It started small. She asked sweetly whether I'd finally let a professional look at that nursery. Because Soren's very handy, but a baby's room isn't a bridge. A ripple of warm laughter. I smiled. Then it got a degree colder. When I mentioned the pediatrician we'd chosen, she corrected me in front of everyone. We chose Soren. Vivian and I chose. You agreed. And Vivian, beside me, didn't say a word, just moved food around her plate. That was the part that cut, not Marguerite's blade, Vivian's silence behind it. Then the peak, delivered like a blessing. She raised her glass mid-meal and said how grateful she was that Vivian had a husband who knows his place in all this, content to provide and let the mother's mother. She looked right at me. Some men need to be the star. Soren's happy being the foundation, aren't you, dear? Content to let the mother's mother, happy being the foundation. She was telling me, in front of a dozen relatives, exactly what she thought I was for. A structural element, load-bearing, invisible, replaceable if you brought in the right contractor, and every person at that table heard a compliment. I said, a foundation only fails one way. I let it sit half a beat, quietly and all at once, when something it was carrying turns out to weigh more than anyone measured. I smiled and reached for the bread. Wonderful roast, Marguerite. She laughed, but she looked at me a second too long, the way you look at a stair that didn't creak the way it always creaks. For just that second, some animal part of her wondered whether the useful man was quite as simple as she'd decided. Then she decided he was. They always decide he is. That decision was the only weapon I had, and she kept handing it back to me, sharpened, every single Sunday. Vivian found me in the driveway after, loading the car. She touched my arm and said, "You know she doesn't mean anything by it." And I looked at my wife, pregnant with a child that might not be mine, defending the woman coaching her to lie. And I said, I know exactly what she means by it. She thought I was forgiving her mother. I was telling her the truth and she couldn't hear it because she'd already decided I couldn't see. Then came the Thursday in May that took the last soft thing in me and set it hard. I came home early. A site inspection got rained out, and I let myself in the side door, quiet, out of habit, and I heard them in the kitchen before they heard me. Marguerite's voice, low and flat, the voice she never used in front of me. Not going to say anything, Vivian. Do you hear me? Not before, not after. You look at that man, and you thank God. He's the kind who doesn't ask questions. And Vivian, small, cracking. What if he already knows? He's been so... He looks at me like... He doesn't know. Men like Soren don't. They're built to trust. It's the best thing about them. A cabinet closed, precise as a gavel. It's the useful thing about them. You raise that baby as his, you never breathe a word about Damon. And in a year, this is a bad dream. He'll love that child so much, he'll never let himself wonder. That's how you use a good man, Vivian. You let his own goodness do the work. I stepped back into the hall. I made noise coming in the second time, the way you do, jingling my keys, calling out that I was home. They were all smiles when I turned the corner. Marguerite kissed my cheek and told me I looked tired and I should rest. Vivian couldn't quite meet my eyes. I asked what smelled good, and Marguerite said she'd made too much. I should eat. I ate. I complimented the food. I did the dishes. The useful thing about them. That's the sentence that finished it, not the affair, not even the baby. The idea, said out loud in my own kitchen, that my kindness was a tool they'd picked up and were using on me. That the best thing about me was that it made me easy to fool. That night, the grief turned into something colder and steadier. Not revenge. I never once wanted to hurt them, and I need you to hear that, because the whole thing only works if you understand it was never about hurting anyone. What I wanted, for the first time in my entire life, was simply to stop being useful to people who mistook my kindness as for a blind spot. A week later, I tested her. I want to be honest about that. I didn't only wait. Once, I pushed, gently, to see what she'd do. Marguerite and I were alone on the porch, Vivian napping. I said, mild as anything, "Can I ask you something?" When Vivian went up to the lake in October, was that the same weekend I was offshore? I've been trying to remember if I was even reachable. I watched her. She didn't blink. She was very, very good. I don't keep the girls' calendars, Soren, she said smoothly and patted my knee. Why on earth are you thinking about last October? No reason, I said. The baby's due. I've just been counting things. Something moved behind her eyes then. Just a flicker, quickly buried. You count too much, she said, and she smiled, and it was a warning wrapped in a joke. Some things a good husband is better off not counting. Some things a good husband is better off not counting. She said it to my face on my own porch, sure to her bones that I never would. I thanked her for the advice. I meant to remember it word for word. I did. The only person I told any of it to, besides Wesley, was my sister. Ada is 4 years older than me and has never once mistaken my kindness for weakness, probably because she watched our father use the same word, steady, to mean the one who won't complain when we take from him. She drove down in May, ostensibly to drop off a crib mobile, actually because she'd heard something in my voice on the phone. We sat on my back steps after Vivian went to bed. I didn't tell her everything. I told her enough. The due date, the weekend, that I'd checked, and the numbers didn't come home. She didn't gasp or rage. She got very still, the way I do. Then she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Oh, no." And it was the first time I'd said that word out loud to another human being since March, and something in my chest came loose. She let me sit with it. Then she said the thing I needed and didn't want. "You're doing the careful thing, the Soren thing, checking twice, saying nothing, protecting everyone." She put her hand on my arm. "Just promise me the person you protect last isn't yourself. You've got a lifetime of practice being the foundation. Don't disappear under this house, too." I told her about the promise I'd made, the truth for the kid no matter what. She nodded slowly. "That's the right promise. It's also going to cost you the most, so I want you to hear me say, I see it." Then quieter, "Whatever that baby turns out to be, you were his father when it counted. Nobody at that table gets to take that from you. Not the mother, not the grandmother, not a lab." I've held on to that sentence the way you hold a railing. She stayed the weekend. She was warm to Vivian, and it half broke me to watch because Ada is not a good liar, and she was doing it for me so no one would suspect anything before I was ready. On Sunday, she hugged me at her car and said, "Lo, when you decide to move, and you will, you call me first, not last." Then she drove off, and I went back inside to my wife and my secret and my grandfather's chair, and for the first time in months, the ground under me had one honest beam in it. The second ally I didn't go looking for at all. He came to me. Vivian's younger brother, Elliot, 26, kind, a little lost. The family's soft one the way I was my family's. He'd been strange around me for months, quiet, guilty, unable to hold my eye at Sunday dinners. In June, he texted and asked if I wanted to grab a beer, just us, and something in the way he asked made me say yes. We sat in the back of a loud bar and he drank too fast and talked about nothing, and then he went quiet, turning his glass, and he said, "Soren, if you knew something about somebody, something that was hurting a person who didn't deserve it, but saying it would blow up your whole family, what would you do?" I looked at this kid, sick with a secret that wasn't his, and I felt the strangest tenderness. I said I'd ask myself who I was protecting by staying quiet, and whether they deserved it more than the person getting hurt. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "I've been sick about something since November." He looked at me. "You're a good guy, that's all. I just wanted to have a beer with a good guy." And he changed the subject, and I let him, because you can't force a person to set down a stone before they're ready. But I drove home knowing two things. Elliot knew, and Elliot's conscience was a fuse already lit. I never asked him to do anything. I want that clear for later, when it matters. I never once asked Elliot to speak. I just knew that a decent person carrying a lie is a different kind of witness than a folder of receipts. A folder can be called fake. A brother crying at a dinner table cannot. The first time I felt the full shape of the trap Marguerite had built, it came through the phone. Vivian's aunt called me, the sister from the shower, on a weeknight, unprompted, just to check in on you, Soren. She'd never once called me before. She asked with enormous gentleness how I was holding up, whether I'd been sleeping, whether the stress of the baby coming was a lot on top of everything you went through last year. She said Marguerite had mentioned I'd seemed a little off lately, and that the family just wanted me to know they were there for me. I sat with the phone against my ear and understood, in real time, that I was hearing the finished product. For months, Marguerite had been laying pipe. Not lies exactly, just a gentle downhill story, repeated to the right ears, so a whole family already held the shape of it. Poor Soren, not himself, fragile since the loss, stressed, a little paranoid maybe. She was preloading the room, so that whenever the truth came out of my mouth, it would land on ears already told to hear it as a symptom. I thanked the aunt. I told her I was fine, actually, sleeping well, looking forward to the baby. Warm, steady, boring. Exactly the man who couldn't possibly be about to detonate anything. Then I sat in the dark of the kitchen for a long time because I finally understood what I was up against, and it was better than I'd thought. Marguerite hadn't just told Vivian to lie. She'd spent half a year building a story that made me the unwell one, so that when the affair someday surfaced, it would curdle into "he took it badly. You know how he's been." It was patient. It was clever. It was, in its way, exactly what I'd been doing, aimed the opposite direction. There's a strange thing that happens when you realize your enemy is as careful as you are. You stop being angry and start being precise. I'd assumed I could just tell the truth someday and be believed. Now I knew better. The truth, said alone, would sound like a symptom. It had to come out in a room, in an order, from mouths that weren't only mine, or it would drown in 6 months of gentle poison before it ever reached the surface. That phone call is the reason I didn't blow it up at home. That phone call is the reason I waited for her table. I drove to the city and saw Wesley one more time before it was over, in his office this time, door closed, a legal pad between us that he never wrote on. I told him what I'd figured out about the poisoned room. He nodded slowly, the way he does when a client finally understands the case he's actually in. "So you can't fight it as a lie," he said, "because she's spent 6 months making the truth sound like a symptom." "Right. Then don't fight it as a lie, fight it as an order of operations." He held up 2 fingers. "You have exactly one advantage in this whole thing, and it's that they think you don't know. The second you spend that, the second you accuse anyone, you're just a husband making a claim, and they've preloaded the room to hear a husband's claim as a breakdown. But if you get up calm before anyone's accused of anything and simply state that you already know and have for months and are fine, you've flipped it. Now anything the mother says to discredit you sounds like a cover-up, because it is one." "I let them react," I said. "You let them react. Guilty people can't stand a calm man who already knows. It makes them talk. And when they talk in a room full of witnesses, they do your work for you." He set the pen down. "You don't bring evidence, Soren, evidence they can call fake. You bring silence and one true sentence, and you let the loudest liar in the room finish it for you." I asked what I'd need to have ready. He said, "Nothing but your nerve and the truth," said once, "without heat. And afterward, this part matters. You leave. You don't stay to win the argument. You've already won it the second she incriminates herself. Winners walk out. Only the desperate stay to keep talking." I reached for my wallet out of habit, and he waved it off. "This one's a gift," he said, "from one quiet guy to another." At the door, he added, "For what it's worth. You're not doing this the cold way. You're doing it the only way a decent man can and stay decent. Most guys can't hold it that long. You held it half a year." I told him holding things was the one thing I'd always been good at. He said, "Yeah, I just hope after this you learn to put some of them down." There's a version of this story where I break, where I put the scarf on the kitchen table and scream and throw the bassinet in the yard. I understand that man. Some nights I was 3 seconds from being him. The night I came closest was the night I finished the nursery. I did the last coat alone, late, Vivian already asleep. Cloud gray, the whole room now soft as fog. I put the crib back where I'd chosen, against the good wall, where Marguerite didn't want it, and I hung the little shelf and set the gray hat on it, the one from the shower. I stood in the middle of that finished room, the room I'd built with my own 2 hands for a boy I'd loved before I ever met him, and I understood, all at once and completely, that I might have painted a nursery for another man's son. That's when it cracked, just for a minute. I sat down on the floor of that gray room with my back against the crib, and I put my face in my hands. And I didn't make a sound, because I'm the man who doesn't make a sound. I'd already been his father. That was the thing no lawyer could file and no lab could measure. I'd read the instructions twice. I'd sat down in an ultrasound room. I'd been his father in every way that costs a man something, and none of that was going to count. and they'd bet the whole thing on the certainty that a man who loves like that is too soft to ever stand up straight. I let myself have that minute on the floor. Then I got up. I turned off the light. I left the door open so the hall light fell across the crib. And I made 2 promises in the dark. The first, whatever the blood said when it finally spoke, that child would get the truth of where he came from. Not a lie dressed up as a happy family. Not a father pretending. Not a childhood built on the exact deception these people thought was so clever. The second, I would not scream and I would not sabotage. And I would not become the villain they'd already cast me as. I would win the only way a decent man can win against people like this. I would stay decent, and I would stay patient, and I would let their own certainty carry them off the cliff. I just had to pick the right cliff. With Wesley's help, I finished the quiet, invisible work. I made sure my name wasn't attached to anything I couldn't walk away from. I didn't hide money. I'm telling you plainly, I never touched $1 that wasn't mine, because I wanted to be able to say that later and mean it. I just stopped being careless. I read what I signed. I asked what I was co-signing. For the first time in my marriage, I checked. Wesley called it housekeeping. I called it learning. At 32, that trusting and checking could live in the same man. So I had my pieces. The timeline proven by a company that gets sued if it lies. The weekend confirmed by a caretaker with no stake in it. The man sitting in a green car outside a school, standing in my driveway. The cover-up spoken aloud in my own kitchen by the woman running it, and denied to my face on my own porch, and a brother whose conscience was coming due. What I did not have, could not have, would not have until a hospital and a lab said so, was the one fact the entire house was balanced on. Whose son was coming? Wesley's 2 cases. I could win the marriage. I had to wait on the baby. So I stopped trying to win the baby case, and I started planning the only ending a patient man gets to choose. Not the loudest one, not the cruelest one, the one where the truth comes out in the right order, from the right mouths, in front of the right people, so that no one ever could rewrite me into the villain. I just needed a room, and Marguerite, God bless her, was about to build me one, because Vivian couldn't carry it to the finish line clean. 3 days before the due date, she cracked first. She walked me into the finished gray room, told me to stay calm, told me she had to tell me something before the baby came. You heard how that started. Now here's what actually happened after her face went white. She'd rehearsed a small confession. I could tell the words came out too smooth, sanded down at the corners, a story she'd practiced in the mirror. A weak moment, she said. Last fall, when things were bad after the loss, she'd run into an old friend, and there had been one night, one mistake, a kiss, nothing more. And she needed me to know before we became parents because she couldn't build a family on a secret. She cried the whole time, and I believe the tears were real. She was confessing the smallest true thing she could survive saying out loud, hoping my forgiveness would seal the rest under concrete forever. She was handing me a splinter so I'd never go looking for the knife. And I stayed calm, exactly like she asked. I nodded. I said thank you for telling me. And then I asked my one soft question, the one I'd been carrying like a stone in my pocket for 2 months. I said, Vivian, when you say one night, do you mean the Friday you drove up to the lake or the Sunday you drove back? The room went very quiet. Because a kiss doesn't have a Friday and a Sunday. A kiss doesn't have a caretaker who mails back a scarf. A kiss doesn't leave a green Subaru in the gravel for 3 days. She stared at me. How? She started and stopped. And I watched her understand in real time that the man too decent to check had checked in March and April and May, had been checking gently, patiently, for half a year, while she and her mother congratulated themselves on his beautiful, useful blindness. I know about the whole weekend, I said. My voice didn't rise. It never rises. That's the whole tragedy of me. I know it was just the 2 of you. I know about Damon and the green car and the scarf that was under your jack until 3 days ago. I know he was outside your school in May, and I know your mother offered him money to disappear, and I know how to count backward from a due date. Soren, please. I'm not going to yell, I said. I'm never going to yell, but I am done being lied to in the room I painted for him. She sat down hard on the edge of the rocking chair, both hands over her mouth, And for the first time in half a year, someone in that family was the one who couldn't control the scene. And it wasn't me. I didn't leave that night. I know some of you wanted me to walk out into the dark and never come back. Suitcase already by the door, like the men in the other stories. But there was a child coming in 3 days, and whatever the blood turned out to say, I was not going to let that child be born into a house on fire. So I made up the couch, and Vivian cried behind the closed door of the gray room, and I lay awake doing the only thing I truly know how to do. I checked my assumptions one more time, in the dark. The 3 days between the nursery and the luncheon were the strangest of my life. Vivian tried, in her way, to put it back. The morning after the confession, she made breakfast. She never makes breakfast, and set it in front of me, and stood there with her hands twisting and said, "We can get through this. People do. For the baby." She said we could go to counseling. She said the affair was over, had been over since the fall, that Damon meant nothing, that she'd been broken after the loss, and I'd been far away, and she'd made a terrible mistake, but our family was worth saving. Every word of it might even have been true. That was the awful part. A truer man might have found something in it to hold on to. But I noticed what she didn't say. In 3 days of pleading to save our family, she never once said the word Damon unless I said it first. Never acknowledged the arithmetic, never offered the one honest thing. I don't know if he's yours, and you deserve to know that. She wanted to rebuild the house without mentioning the crack in the foundation. She wanted my forgiveness to work like a permit that let her skip the inspection. I was gentle with her. I want you to know that. I didn't punish her in those 3 days. I didn't sleep in the bed, but I made her tea and told her to rest. And once, when she cried at the sink, I stood beside her and let her lean on me, because she was about to give birth, and cruelty has never once made me feel better. But I didn't promise her anything. I'd learned, finally, that being kind and being fooled are two different things, and that a good man is allowed to be the first without agreeing to be the second. On the third morning, she stopped pleading and went quiet, and I knew she'd called her mother. The next thing out of her mouth was a threat. That's how I knew the soft war was over and the real one had started. 2 days before the luncheon, they hit back. Vivian came to me in the morning, calm now, composed, rehearsed. I recognized the cadence. It was Marguerite's voice coming out of her daughter's mouth. She said she'd talked to her mother. She said that if I made this ugly, if I said anything to anyone, she would tell the family a different story, that I'd become paranoid and cold during the pregnancy, that I'd checked out after the loss, that I'd been cruel and distant and controlling, and that she'd turned to an old friend one lonely time because her husband had abandoned her when she needed him most. She said it gently, almost sadly, like she was warning me about a storm. She said no one would believe the quiet, checked-out engineer over a grieving pregnant wife, and she said her mother had already, so carefully, over the last few months, mentioned to a few relatives that Soren just hasn't been himself lately. They'd built the gossip in advance. They'd been laying the story for months, so that when the truth came, the family would already be holding the counter-story, pre-installed. And, I'll be honest with you, for one long night, it worked on me. That was the bottom of the whole thing. Lower than the folder, lower than the scarf, lower than the floor of the gray room, because I lay on that couch and I saw it play out exactly the way she described it. The weeping pregnant wife, the family closing around her like a fist, the caretaker 3 hours away who'd never repeat a word of it to anyone official, the scarf I'd left where it lay, the paternity I could not prove, and me, right, completely right, and utterly alone with it, recast as the paranoid husband who turned on a woman in labor. I remember lying there thinking, I checked everything, and I still might lose. That's the part they don't tell you about being right. Being right is not the same as being believed, and a lie planted for 6 months has roots the truth, arriving all at once, can't always tear out. Somewhere before dawn, I stopped trying to win the case I couldn't win, and I remembered Wesley's 2 cases, and I finally understood the shape of the only move I had. I did not need to prove the baby wasn't mine. Not yet. Not at that table. I did not need a folder, or the scarf, or the caretaker's log, or a single receipt. I needed one thing, and only one thing. I needed Marguerite, confident and cornered, in a room full of family, believing right up to the final second that I was still the useful man who doesn't ask questions, to underestimate me out loud, one last time, where everyone could hear it. Because a prepared story only works if the person telling it stays in control. And I had spent 32 years learning exactly how to make controlling people lose control. You don't fight them, you get very, very calm, and you let them swing at a man who isn't there anymore. Marguerite was about to hand me the perfect room. She just didn't know it yet. She'd planned a luncheon, a family blessing, she called it, the Sunday before the due date. Both sides, or what there was of mine. My sister Ada drove in, and Wesley came, though only I knew why. 14 people around the long table in Marguerite's dining room, under the good chandelier, with the china that only came out for occasions that mattered to her image. She'd built it, I understood now, as insurance. A room full of witnesses to watch Soren, the good husband, beam over his pregnant wife, a memory she could point to forever if anything ever came out. Look how happy he was. Look how loved she was. Whatever he says now, look. She thought she was staging my devotion. She was staging her own collapse. The morning of the luncheon, I put on a good shirt. I helped Vivian with her coat because she was 39 weeks pregnant, and it's hard to reach your sleeves. And I did it gently. And she looked at me like she genuinely couldn't tell which man was going to show up to lunch. Good. Neither could she guess. Neither could her mother. We drove over in silence. I carried the flowers. The dining room was exactly what Marguerite wanted it to be. The chandelier, 14 chairs, cloth napkins folded into little peaks. My sister across the table, uneasy, catching something in my face she couldn't name and glancing back at it. Wesley beside me, calm as a Sunday morning. Elliot at the far end, pale, not eating, watching his mother with the look of a man standing at the edge of a high place. And at the head of the table, silver and serene, my mother-in-law, tapping her wine glass with a knife to gather the room. She stood and gave a toast. She was good at it. She talked about family and weathering storms and how proud she was of Vivian and of the fine, steady man her daughter had chosen. She looked right at me when she said steady. She said warmly to a warm room, "Not every family is lucky enough to have a man who never makes a fuss." A few relatives chuckled and raised their glasses. Vivian stared into her water. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I said, "Thank you, Marguerite, for the toast, for the bassinet, and for something else." Then I said to the whole table in the flattest, kindest voice I own, "I want to say something in front of everyone, calmly, so no one can ever tell it to you wrong later. I've known for months that this baby was conceived the week I was working offshore, off the coast of Maine, 19 days, on the company's own logs. I've known about the weekend at the lake, and about the man who was there, and about the fact that there were no sisters on that trip. Since April, I've said nothing to anyone. I am not surprised. I am not paranoid. I am not cruel. And I have not been unwell." I looked around the table, unhurried. "I have been patient, and I wanted all of you to hear me say that in a steady voice before anyone tries to tell you I lost my mind." Silence. The real kind. A fork touched a plate somewhere, and it sounded like a bell. Vivian had gone white. Marguerite had gone sharp. And here's the thing about people who've spent months certain you're a fool. When you finally show them you were never the fool, they don't get quiet. They get frightened. And frightened people reach, on instinct, for the story they've already rehearsed. Marguerite laughed, one brittle note, and said to the table, "Oh, he's not well. He hasn't been himself since the miscarriage. Vivian and I have been so worried about him for months. This is exactly what I've been warning everyone about." There it was, right on schedule. The prepared story deployed. I let it sit for one full second. Then I said quietly, "You've been warning them for months." That's the interesting part, Marguerite, because I never told you I suspected anything. I never told anyone in this family a single word. So how did you know, back in the winter, that there'd be something for me to be paranoid about, unless you already knew what there was for me to find? Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. I turned to the table, still calm, still kind, and I laid it in front of them like a beam across two supports. "She warned you all that I wasn't myself before I'd said one word to anyone. You cannot warn a room about a fire you've never seen." I looked back at her. "Unless you were the one who said it, and you were afraid of the smoke." "That is enough." Marguerite's voice cracked on the second word, and that crack was the whole story. You will not do this to my daughter. You will not blow up this entire family over one mistake. He'll never. And she caught herself half a second too late, the way you grab for a glass that's already left your hand. He wasn't supposed to. The room heard it. Every person at that table heard it. He'll never. He wasn't supposed to. Not supposed to check. Not supposed to find out. Not supposed to be anything but useful. She'd said the quiet part out loud, with the good china on the table, and you could watch it land on face after face down both sides of that room. That was the first wave. She hung herself on her own certainty, but it was her own sister who pulled the second one loose. The aunt, the one from the shower, the one who'd called to check on me, set down her glass and said into the silence, slow and horrified, "Marguerite, what wasn't he supposed to find out?" And Vivian, 39 weeks pregnant, cornered between the man she'd lied to and the mother who taught her how, put both hands over her face and said through them, wet and ruined and finally true, because it might not be his, the baby, it might be Damon's, and she told me to let Soren raise it and never know. The room did not gasp. It went utterly still, which is worse. 14 people learning the shape of a thing all at once. And then, at the end of the table, Elliot stood up. I had not asked him to. I want that on the record. He stood on his own, pale and shaking, and set down a stone he'd been carrying since November. "Mom told me too," he said. Not to me, to the whole family, to his aunts and his cousins and the good china. Back in the fall, she told me to keep my mouth shut about the lake weekend, about Damon, about all of it. She said Soren was steady, and Soren would raise the baby, and Soren would never know, and it was better for everyone. And I've been sick every single day since. He looked at his sister, and his voice broke clean in half. "Viv, I couldn't be part of it anymore. I'm sorry. But he didn't deserve it. Not him." 3 voices now. Marguerite's slip, Vivian's confession, Elliot's testimony, the truth arriving in the right order, from the right mouths, in front of every witness who mattered, with no folder, no recording, no receipt for anyone to call fake, just people at a family table finally telling it straight. Marguerite tried one more time. "It's almost the saddest part." She stood, gripping the back of her chair, and turned to the room with the voice she'd used to run every family Christmas for 40 years, and said, "This is a private family matter, and I will not have it discussed at my table. Everyone, please, sit down and finish your lunch." And no one moved. That was the moment I knew it was over. Not when she slipped, not even when Elliot spoke, but when she gave an order in that room, and for the first time in any of our lives, the room didn't obey. Her sister was staring at her like she'd never seen her before. A cousin had pushed his chair back from the table. My own sister had a hand over her mouth. The chandelier hummed over a dozen people who'd just watched a careful woman's careful world come apart in the space of 90 seconds, and not one of them reached for a fork. Power is a strange thing. Marguerite had all of it in that family, right up until the second everyone saw exactly what she'd been using it for. Then she had none, and she lost it the way a foundation fails, quietly, and all at once, when the weight it was hiding finally came due. And me, standing there calm, having done nothing at that lunch but ask one honest question in a level voice. Vivian was crying, but differently now. Not the rehearsed tears from the nursery, the other kind. The kind that comes when the story you told yourself finally falls down around you and you have to look at what's underneath. I didn't gloat. I need you to know that, because it's the part I'm proudest of. There was no piece of me that enjoyed watching her come apart. I had loved her for 6 years, and some part of me always will. But loving someone does not obligate you to be lied to in the room you painted for a child. I picked up the flowers I'd carried in. They'd been for her. And I set them down gently in front of her, because I'm not the kind of man who takes back flowers, even now. Then I said to the whole room in the same steady voice I'd used to tell you a bridge would hold, "I'm not going to raise my voice, and I'm not going to make threats, and I am not going to pretend. When the baby comes, we will do a legal paternity test, the ordinary way, with everyone's consent, in the open. Whatever it says, that child is going to grow up knowing the truth about where he came from. If he's mine, I'll love him out loud and honestly, apart from a marriage I can no longer be in. If he isn't, then his father has a right to know his son exists. The chance I very nearly didn't get. And that boy has a right to know where he came from. No child in this family is going to be raised as a lie to protect the adults who told it. If you've ever had to be the calm one in a room full of people counting on you to stay quiet, if you've ever found out your patience was being used against you like a tool, take this with you, because it's the only thing I've got worth passing on. Your kindness was never the weakness. There's certainty that it was. That was the weakness. And it was always entirely theirs. Set your boundary in a steady voice. You don't have to get loud to stop being used. I walked out of that dining room, under the good chandelier, past the 14 chairs and the untouched food, and no one stopped me. Wesley followed a step behind. My sister caught my arm at the door and just held on for a second. Then I drove home to a gray nursery with the hall light still falling across the crib. The boy came 9 days later, in the gray hour before morning. I was there. I want that on the record too. I did not abandon a woman in labor, whatever anyone might still try to say. I sat in the hospital hallway all night because whatever else was true, a person was being born, and someone in that family was going to be steady one last time, and it was going to be me. I heard him cry through the door. I'm not ashamed to say I cried too, out in that hallway. For a boy born into the middle of all of it through no fault of his own. We did the test the ordinary way, both of us consenting, a form and a lab and 2 weeks of waiting. He wasn't mine. I'd known, in the part of me that does the math when it's boring to do the math. But knowing and knowing are two different things, and when the letter came, I sat in my truck in a parking lot again, the way I had in April, and let myself grieve the son I'd painted a room for. That grief was real. It's still real. You don't stop loving a child because a lab confirms the arithmetic. I'd been his father for 9 months in every way that costs a man something, and no result on a page could take those months back out of me. I didn't want them back out. But here's what all that patience bought me. I got to grieve him as a good man and not as a fool. I got to walk away clean, my name on nothing I'd regret. A family full of witnesses who'd heard the truth in the right order, from me first in a steady voice, and from Marguerite's own frightened mouth second. There was never a version where I was the cruel one. I'd made sure of that in March, and April, and May, and at that long table under the chandelier. Damon knows he has a son now. I made that call myself, engineer to the last. Because a boy deserves a father who chose to know him, and because doing the right thing was the whole point of not becoming the other man. Vivian and I are divorcing, quietly, without a war. There's a child in the middle of it, and I won't make his life a battlefield. Marguerite doesn't speak to me, which is the kindest thing she's ever done for me. Elliot and I still get coffee. He did a hard, decent thing at real cost to himself. And I don't forget the people who tell the truth when it would be so much easier to stay quiet. I sold the blue house on the street, named after a tree that doesn't grow there anymore. But I painted the nursery back to white before I handed over the keys. I still don't fully know why. Maybe so the next family gets a clean wall to start their own hope on. Maybe because I needed to stand in that room one last time and prove to myself I could come out the other side of it still gentle. I stood there a while in the white, in the smell of fresh paint, and then I closed the door and left it closed. People keep asking whether the whole thing made me hard, whether I regret being the kind of man who trusts. No, I regret nothing about the trusting. I only regret how many years I let people convince me the trusting and checking couldn't live in the same man. They can. That's the whole thing I learned at 32 in a gray room I built with my own hands. You can love someone completely and still count the weeks. You can forgive a great deal and still refuse, absolutely, to be lied to in the room you built for a child. They thought my kindness meant I'd never look. They mistook the quietest man at the table for the blindest one. That was their mistake. It was never mine.